You ever have one of those moments where you can just feel someone's about to make the biggest mistake of their week? That was me, right there, standing in my own cabin, holding a duffel bag I just set down, when I heard this loud, impatient knock on my front door. And it wasn't a friendly, welcome to the neighborhood, kind of knock either. No, this was the kind of knock that said, I'm here to tell you what to do whether you like it or not. I'd just gotten back from a long month away working out of state. My plan was simple: unpack my things, brew myself a strong coffee, step out onto the porch, and breathe in that lake air I'd missed so badly. This cabin had always been my escape from the noise of the world. But apparently, my return wasn't going to be as peaceful as I'd imagined. Through the curtain, I spotted her, a woman I'd never seen before, standing on my porch with her arms folded so tight across her chest that I wondered if her circulation was even working. She had the kind of look that said she'd been practicing this moment in her head all morning. Short blonde hair, sunglasses perched on top like a crown, lips pressed so hard together you'd think she was holding back a lecture for the entire planet. I instantly knew the type, the HOA enforcer. Not the official one necessarily, but the kind who thinks they're the unofficial sheriff of the block. I opened the door just enough to be polite, and before I could even say, hello, she fired off the first words. You can't be here. I blinked, a little caught off guard. Excuse me? This cabin is part of the HOA, she said, her voice sharp and clipped, like she was reading from a script. We have strict rules about who can be on the property. You're not allowed here without permission. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing right there. Ma'am, I said, keeping my tone calm, I own this cabin. My name is on the deed. I've had it for years. She let out a short, disbelieving scoff. I know every property owner in this community, and I've never seen you before. Either you leave right now, or I'm calling the police. Trespassing is a serious offense. Her words didn't rattle me one bit. I've dealt with all kinds of people in my life, from military hotheads to corporate blowhards, and the one thing I've learned is that the louder someone talks, the less they usually know. I leaned casually against the doorframe and said, go ahead. Please, call them. That answer clearly wasn't what she was expecting. Most people in her little power trip scenarios probably stammer, apologize, maybe even pack up and leave. But I just stood there, relaxed, sipping the coffee I'd managed to pour before answering the door. Her eyes narrowed to slits. She spun on her heel, marched down my porch steps like she was leading a parade, and whipped out her phone right there in the driveway. I could hear her voice as clear as day. Not because she was close, but because she was practically shouting into the receiver. Yes, this is the HOA president, she started, making sure I could hear that title loud and clear. I need police at the lake cabin, there's a man trespassing. Possible break-in. Yes, I'm looking at him right now. No, I don't know his name, he's refusing to leave. She kept adding these little dramatic pauses like she was auditioning for a soap opera. Yes, I feel unsafe. Unsafe? She was the one who came to my door. I went back inside, shaking my head with a grin. I'd dealt with enough petty control freaks in my time to know that this was going to end in one of two ways: either she'd get told off by the responding officer, or she'd dig herself into a hole so deep that she wouldn't be able to show her face around here for weeks. Either way, I had nothing to worry about. I set my coffee mug down on the table and glanced around my cabin. My fishing gear stacked in the corner, the framed photos from my service days hanging on the wall, the same view of the lake I'd enjoyed for years. Everything about this place screamed mine. And the idea that some stranger could just walk up and try to run me off my own land, well, it was almost funny. Still, I could hear her pacing outside, talking to whoever she had on the line, repeating herself over and over like she was trying to make her case airtight. I didn't interrupt. I didn't step out to argue. I knew the best thing I could do right now was to let this little performance play out. About 10 minutes later, I heard it, the distant crunch of tires on gravel. The sound grew louder, and a moment later, the red and blue flashes lit up the trees beyond my porch. The cavalry had arrived. Through the window, I saw the police SUV pull up, dust swirling in its wake. Karen, though I didn't know her name yet, Karen felt fitting. Straightened her stance like she was about to receive an award. She even waved the officer over with a self-important flick of her hand, as if he were there to carry out her personal orders. I didn't move. I stayed on my porch chair, coffee in hand, calm as ever. My gut told me this was about to turn into one of the most satisfying conversations I'd had in months. The police SUV door swung open, and out stepped a tall officer with broad shoulders, a clean uniform, and a no-nonsense posture. His mirrored sunglasses reflected the lake behind me, and for a second I wondered if he'd immediately clock the fact that I didn't look like a guy who'd just broken into a cabin. Karen, on the other hand, wasted no time. She practically sprinted to him, waving her arms like an air traffic controller trying to get a jet to land. "Officer. Thank goodness you're here," she began, voice high-pitched with faux urgency. "This man has broken into that cabin." She pointed so sharply in my direction that I half expected her finger to snap. "I saw him dragging things inside. He's trespassing, he's refusing to leave, and he's not supposed to be here. This is HOA property, and I'm the president. I have the authority to have him removed immediately." The officer didn't say much at first. He listened, or at least pretended to, nodding slightly. His face was unreadable, and I could tell that was making Karen a little nervous. She kept talking, piling on more and more details, most of them exaggerated or completely made up. "I've lived here for years, officer. I know everyone, and I've never seen this man before in my life. He's dangerous. He's probably armed. I'm telling you." "Ma'am," the officer interrupted, holding up a single hand in that way cops do when they've had enough. "I'm going to speak with him directly." Karen stepped back, clearly thinking this was just part of the process before he'd slap cuffs on me and haul me away. She crossed her arms again and tilted her chin up, smug as ever. She probably thought she'd be back in her HOA office in 30 minutes bragging about how she handled a trespasser. The officer turned and walked toward my porch, his boots crunching on the gravel path. I didn't move from my chair. I just set my coffee cup down, stood up slowly, and stepped forward to meet him halfway. As he got closer, he tilted his head slightly, almost like he was trying to get a better look at me. Then, suddenly, his pace slowed. When he was just a few steps away, he stopped, reached up, and slid those mirrored sunglasses off his face. That's when I saw the shift. His serious, neutral expression melted into a wide, almost disbelieving smile. "Captain," he said, his voice filled with recognition. I felt my own grin spreading. "Sergeant?" I replied, a little surprised myself but not entirely shocked. It had been years since I'd last seen him, but I never forget the faces of the men I served with. He straightened his back immediately and snapped into a crisp salute, the kind you could frame for a recruiting poster. "Orders, sir." From behind him, I heard an audible gasp. Karen had been close enough to hear every word, and judging by the sudden stiffness in her posture, her little HOA fantasy was beginning to crumble. I turned my head slightly to glance at her, and the look on her face was priceless, wide eyes, slack jaw, and the tiniest flicker of panic starting to bloom. I returned the salute slowly, deliberately, and said, "At ease, Sergeant." He stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough for me to hear. "Didn't expect to find you out here, Captain. You living in the area now?" "Been here for a while," I said. "This is my cabin. Been mine since before this whole HOA was even a thing." The sergeant glanced over his shoulder toward Karen, then back at me. "She called in a suspected burglary. Said you were trespassing." I chuckled. "I know. She introduced herself as the HOA president, told me to leave my own property. I figured letting her call you would save me the trouble of explaining things myself. The sergeant's mouth twitched like he was fighting back a laugh. Then he turned toward Karen and took a step in her direction. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "this man is my former commanding officer. He served this country with distinction for over 20 years. He has full legal ownership of this property. He's not trespassing, and he's certainly not breaking into anything." Karen blinked rapidly, her mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled out of water. But, he's not in our HOA database. I know every homeowner here." "That's because," I interjected, taking a step down the porch steps, "my land is not, and never has been, part of your HOA. I bought it before you or your rules existed. Your authority stops at my driveway. You have no say over my cabin, my property, or me." Karen's cheeks flushed bright red, the kind of shade you only see on people who've been caught dead wrong but refuse to admit it. We have community standards," she muttered weakly, as if that somehow changed the law. The sergeant raised an eyebrow. "Community standards don't override private property rights, ma'am. And I'd also like to point out that making a false police report is a serious matter. You told dispatch there was a break-in. That's not what happened." I could practically see her brain scrambling to find a way out. Her mouth worked like she was about to speak, then she just swallowed hard and said, It was a misunderstanding. I was only trying to keep the neighborhood safe." The sergeant kept his gaze locked on her. "Then I suggest in the future, you verify facts before calling 911. Otherwise, you'll be explaining your misunderstanding to a judge." Karen looked like she just swallowed a lemon. She mumbled something unintelligible, turned on her heel, and stormed off toward the street. I watched her go, her posture a little less confident now, her stride a little quicker, as if putting distance between herself and this conversation might somehow erase it from existence. The sergeant waited until she was out of earshot, then glanced at me with a smirk. "Still finding ways to make people regret bad decisions, huh, Captain?" I laughed. I didn't even have to do anything. She set herself up for this one. "Yeah," he said, shaking his head. "I've only been stationed here for a few months, but she's already called us half a dozen times for stuff that's not even police business. Kids fishing on the dock. Someone parking too close to her driveway. Heck, last week she reported a boat looking suspicious." I raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like a real piece of work." "You have no idea," he said, chuckling. Then his expression softened a little. "It's good to see you again, sir. Brings back memories." "Same here," I replied. "And for the record, you handled that perfectly." He grinned. "Guess some training sticks forever." We shared a firm handshake, the kind that carries more meaning than words. Behind us, the lake shimmered in the sunlight, and I could feel the tension from earlier melting away. Little did Karen know, her stunt had just backfired in the biggest way possible. Not only had she failed to run me off, but now the local police knew exactly who I was and exactly how I liked my coffee when they dropped by. And that, in my book, was a win. I stepped down off the porch, the wood creaking under my boots, and walked the short distance to stand beside the sergeant. Karen was still lingering halfway down the driveway, clearly not ready to give up the fight but also smart enough to know she'd already lost the first round. She kept glancing between us, her lips pressed into a thin line, her hands on her hips like she was ready to launch into another speech if given the chance. I figured I might as well put the final nail in the coffin before she could start. "Karen," I said. I didn't know her real name yet, but the flicker in her eyes told me the nickname fit. "There's something you need to understand. This property has been mine since the day I signed the papers. It is not, has never been, and never will be part of your HOA. Your rules don't apply here. You don't get to tell me who can or can't be on my land." Her nostrils flared. "We have boundaries for a reason. This cabin is inside our community limits." Everyone who lives here has to abide by the same standards. That's what keeps the neighborhood safe. Safe from what? I asked, keeping my tone even. Fishing poles? Campfires? The sound of someone enjoying their own property in peace? She bristled at my sarcasm, and I could see the color in her cheeks deepen. The sergeant stepped in then, his voice calm but firm, the kind of tone that ended arguments in their tracks. Ma'am, I've already explained this man's ownership is valid. His property line falls outside your HOA jurisdiction. That means your standards have no legal weight here. If you try to enforce them again, you're overstepping your authority. Her eyes narrowed into slits. So you're saying anyone can just do whatever they want, as long as they own the land? That's exactly what I'm saying, the sergeant replied, without missing a beat. This is America. We have property rights. And part of my job is making sure those rights are respected. Even if that means telling the HOA president she's wrong. I almost laughed at that, but I kept my expression steady. Karen, however, looked like she'd been personally insulted. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her hands now clasped tightly in front of her, like she was holding back from saying something she knew would get her in even more trouble. You should also know, the sergeant added, that making a false police report is no small matter. You told dispatch there was a possible break-in. That's a criminal offense if proven to be intentional. I'm being generous by treating this as a misunderstanding. Her gaze dropped to the gravel at her feet. For the first time since she marched up to my cabin, she looked unsure of herself. It was like the fight had been drained out of her, but she didn't want to admit it. I was just trying to do the right thing, she mumbled. The right thing, I said, would have been knocking on my door, asking who I was, and listening to the answer before calling the police. Instead, you assumed the worst and dragged an officer out here for no reason. The sergeant glanced at me, then back at her. If this happens again, ma'am, it will go in the system as a harassment call. That means the next officer who responds won't be so understanding. Her lips twitched like she wanted to argue, but she kept quiet. With a stiff nod, she muttered something about needing to get back to work and finally turned away for good this time. She walked off faster than she'd arrived, and I had the distinct feeling she was already thinking about how to spin this story to her HOA board so she wouldn't look like the villain. The sergeant watched her leave, then shook his head with a sigh. Some people just can't stand the idea that they're not in charge of everything they see. Yeah, I agreed. Unfortunately, they're often the loudest ones. He smiled faintly, then turned toward me. So, Captain, you gonna invite an old friend in for a cup of coffee? I grinned. Already have it brewed. You still take it black? Wouldn't have it any other way. We headed back up to the porch, and I poured him a mug. We sat in the two old rocking chairs that had been on that porch since the day I bought the place. The lake breeze was cool, carrying the faint smell of pine from the trees that lined the shore. It felt good to relax after the little storm that had just passed. We talked for a while, catching up on everything that had happened since we'd last seen each other. He told me about his transfer to the county, how he'd been working mostly small-town calls but had already noticed a certain HOA president seemed to think the police were her personal enforcers. She's called us at least once a week since I got here, he said, shaking his head. Last time it was because some kids were fishing off the public dock. Before that, she wanted us to ticket someone for having a non-approved mailbox. And don't get me started on the whole flagpole incident. Flagpole incident? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Guy put up a flagpole in his own yard, perfectly legal. She said it was too tall and wanted us to take it down. We had to explain to her, again, that we don't enforce HOA rules. I chuckled. Sounds like she needs a hobby that doesn't involve bothering other people. She's got a hobby, he said dryly. It's called being the neighborhood dictator. We both laughed at that, and for a moment, it felt like we were back in the old days, swapping stories over bad coffee in some dusty outpost halfway around the world. After a while, he stood and set his empty mug down on the porch railing. "I'd better get back on patrol before dispatch wonders if I fell in the lake. But I'll log this as a civil misunderstanding, so next time she calls about you, it'll flag as a repeat nuisance call." "That's appreciated," I said sincerely. "Maybe it'll make her think twice before trying something like this again." "Doubt it," he said with a smirk. "But at least the department will know the real story." We shook hands, firm, solid, with that unspoken respect that comes from shared history. Then he headed back to his SUV, gave me one last nod, and drove off down the gravel road, the dust hanging in the air long after he was gone. I stood there on the porch for a while, watching the lake and listening to the gentle lap of the water against the shore. The sun was starting to dip lower, casting everything in a warm golden glow. For the first time since I'd returned, I felt the peace I'd been looking forward to. Karen had tried to turn my homecoming into a confrontation, but instead, she'd given me an afternoon of catching up with an old friend and the satisfaction of watching her plans backfire. And something told me that the next time she saw me, she'd think twice before dialing 911. Because now she knew, the cops weren't here to take orders from her. After the sergeant's SUV disappeared down the gravel road, the sound of his engine fading into the trees, I let out a slow breath and settled back into my rocking chair. The porch boards groaned beneath me in that familiar, comforting way. The kind of sound that says, "You're home." I reached for my coffee again, now just lukewarm, but I didn't care. The air off the lake was cool and fresh, carrying the faint scent of pine and water. The sun was low enough that the light danced across the ripples like molten gold. It was exactly the kind of evening I'd been picturing during the long, noisy weeks away from here. I thought about the last hour, and a grin tugged at the corners of my mouth. Karen had come in full force, confident she could throw her imaginary weight around, and left in a huff with her ego bruised. If I were the type to keep score, this would be one for the books. But more than that, it had been a reminder that not everyone can be reasoned with. Some people need to be shown, in no uncertain terms, that they've picked the wrong fight. And thanks to the sergeant, she got that message loud and clear. The thing is, I've dealt with people like her before, in and out of uniform. The kind who think a title, HOA president, in this case, gives them the right to control everyone around them. They thrive on compliance, on people being too polite or too intimidated to push back. But the second they run into someone who knows their rights, their whole world tilts. And trust me, once they feel that shift, they don't forget it. I knew she'd be back eventually. Maybe not to my porch, but in some form. People like her don't just roll over and accept defeat. She'd either stew about it quietly or try to find another angle to assert herself. That's why the sergeant's parting gift, logging this as a civil misunderstanding, was more valuable than she realized. It meant the next time she tried to drag the police into one of her little crusades, she'd be facing a dispatcher who already had her pegged as a nuisance caller. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how perfectly things had played out. If I'd argued with her on my own, it would have been my word against hers. But by letting her call the cops, I gave her just enough rope to hang her own credibility. And the fact that the responding officer was someone I'd commanded? That was the cherry on top. As the sun dropped lower, I decided to stretch my legs. I walked down to the dock, the old wood planks worn smooth from years of my boots and fishing gear being dragged across them. The water lapped gently at the posts, and a few ducks floated lazily near the reeds. I could see my reflection in the lake, a little older than the last time I'd really looked, a little more lined around the eyes, but still standing tall. It struck me then how important this place was to me. Not just the cabin, but the land, the water, the quiet. It wasn't just a piece of property, it was freedom. A space where I didn't have to answer to anyone, where I could wake up with the sun or stay out under the stars without some self-appointed authority telling me I was breaking rules. And that's exactly why Karen's attempt to stake a claim here bothered me more than I'd admitted. By the time I walked back up to the cabin, the sky had shifted to deep orange and purple. I lit the porch lantern, more out of habit than necessity, and sat back down. The crickets had started their evening chorus, and somewhere across the lake, I could hear the faint thump of someone chopping wood. Life here was simple, predictable in the best way. And if Karen wanted to stir that up, she'd find herself fighting a losing battle. About half an hour later, I saw movement at the edge of the trees near the road. A figure paused just beyond the reach of my porch light, and even without seeing her face clearly, I knew it was Karen. She wasn't marching this time. She stood there, watching, like she was debating whether to approach again. I didn't move. I didn't wave. I just sipped my coffee and let the silence stretch. After a long moment, she turned and walked away. No words, no gestures, just a slow retreat. That was when I knew I'd gotten through to her, even if she'd never admit it. She'd learned that I wasn't someone she could intimidate. And maybe, just maybe, she realized there were better uses of her energy than trying to police a man sitting on his own porch. The rest of the night passed peacefully. I grilled some fresh fish I'd caught months ago and frozen, poured myself a small drink, and sat by the fire pit watching sparks drift into the night sky. The stars out here are brighter than anywhere else I've been, so bright they almost feel close enough to touch. I leaned back in my chair and let the heat from the fire and the cool night air blend into that perfect balance only a lakeside evening can give. Sometime after midnight, I locked up the cabin and headed inside. The old floorboards creaked under my feet, and the familiar smell of cedar and smoke wrapped around me like a blanket. I slept like a rock. No interruptions, no knocks on the door, no drama. When morning came, the first light crept through the blinds, painting the room in soft gold. I brewed another pot of coffee, stepped out onto the porch, and took in the stillness. The lake was glassy, not a ripple in sight. A few birds were already darting across the surface, and somewhere in the distance, a loon called out. That's when the sergeant's words from yesterday replayed in my mind. Some people just can't stand the idea that they're not in charge of everything they see. Karen might still be out there plotting her next move, but I wasn't losing any sleep over it. Because now, she knew the truth, I wasn't some random stranger she could push around. I was the man who owned this land, who'd served long enough to earn the respect of the lawmen she thought would do her bidding. And the best part? If she ever did call again, the officer who showed up would already know exactly who I was, and exactly who she was. That alone made me smile into my coffee. Owning a cabin like this isn't just about having a place to escape. It's about knowing that when you sit on your porch and look out at the water, you're looking at something that's truly yours. No HOA rulebook, no self-important neighbor, and no loud knock on the door can change that. By the time I finished my coffee, the sun was fully up, and I decided it was a good day to take the boat out. Maybe do some fishing, maybe just drift and enjoy the peace. As I pushed off from the dock, the cabin shrinking behind me, I felt that deep, unshakable contentment that comes from knowing you stood your ground and didn't let anyone take away what mattered. Karen had learned a lesson. The sergeant and I had reconnected. And me? I was right where I belonged, giving orders to no one, taking orders from no one, and enjoying every second of it. Because out here, on my land, in my cabin, I make the rules. And that's the way it's going to stay.